Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so honored to have best-selling author Waubgeshig Rice here to talk with us about his books Moon of the Crusted Snow and also his newest, Moon of the Turning Leaves. Hi, Wab. How are you?
Hey, Brandon. I'm great, thanks. Just really honored to be with you tonight. Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course. We are so excited to have you here. I know everybody wants to get started, but let me take care of some of that kind of standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then we will dive in. Just so everybody knows, I have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration. So thank you for doing that. But you also can continue to submit questions for the entirety of the talk by clicking the questions button that's just below the live stream video. If you're already in full screen mode, you might need to minimize that or you won't see the tabs underneath. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever. All registrants will receive a link to the recording in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Waubgeshig Rice is an author and journalist originally from Waubgeshig First Nation. His books include the Independent Publishers Book Award-winning short story collection, Midnight Sweat Lodge, and the national best-selling novel Moon of the Crusted Snow, and of course, Moon of the Turning Leaves. Reporting for CBC News for the bulk of his journalism career, in 2014, he received the Anishinaabe Nation's Deb Waywen Citation for Excellence in First Nation Storytelling. And from 2018 to 2020, he hosted Up North, CBC Radio's afternoon show for Northern Ontario. Again, welcome, Wab. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks a lot. Really excited to chat with you tonight.
I'm super excited to dive in. I have to thank you for your amazing Instagram videos.
Oh, thanks.
not only in pronouncing Anishinaabe words, but just the entertainment value.
Thanks.
I've gotten to like a deep scroll once I started looking at this.
Well, you got to try to have fun a little bit on social media, right? Otherwise, who would want to stay on that long, So appreciate you checking out all those videos.
Definitely. Okay, so to start us off, because we are going to kind of go back and forth between the two books, can you give us a short summary of each of them? I know one is kind of going into the apocalypse and one is kind of post-apocalyptic, just so we can delineate the two.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Moon of the Crusted Snow is about Anishinaabe community in Northern Ontario that endures a mysterious blackout. And this community is quite remote. It's mostly a fly-in only reserve. But because, living that far north with unreliable infrastructure, the power outage is not that big of a deal at first for the community. People there still live off the land. They can hunt, fish, gather. They know how to adapt to a situation like this. So this mysterious prolonged blackout isn't an immediate crisis for them, but as the weeks go on, there's no word from the south. Nobody knows what's going on. And then all of a sudden, an unexpected visitor arrives from one of the cities to the south. And then he's followed by a few more people. And then the community has to make some tough decisions about its future. So, tension builds. Things come to a head, and then ultimately we see this community sort of transition itself into this new future, because without giving too much away, spoiler alert, there's going to be a few giveaways as we talk about both stories tonight. But as the story ends, the community moves into a new settlement and sort of starts this new era post-blackout, right? Post-apocalypse. And it's kind of like a rebirth for them as they return to their traditional Indigenous ways. So Moon of the Turning Leaves takes place 10 years after the end of Moon of the Crusted Snow, so 12 years after the initial blackout. And we find many of the same characters in this new settlement that they've created, but because they've been isolated in the same place for so long, they recognize that a lot of their natural resources like food, medicine, and so on are starting to dwindle. And they also recognize that traditionally, as Anishinaabe people, they would have been more migratory. They would have moved from place to place historically, allowing the land to replenish itself, and of course, being respectful of natural cycles and so on. So as they realize that, they're running out of food, they decide that maybe it's time to go south. Because it's explained in the first book that this community was displaced from the Great Lakes to far northern Ontario, which happened throughout North American history. Many Indigenous communities were displaced hundreds of kilometers / miles from their original settlements. So they decide to go south to see if they can resettle in their original homeland, and also to see what's left of the world if in fact it has ended, because as mentioned, they have been isolated. They don't know for sure what's happened. So a few key characters go sort of on this quest of discovery over the course of a summer, and they encounter, I guess, some wild and wacky things on this journey. So that's the second book in a nutshell.
You were talking about tension building, and that especially in both books, but in Moon of the Crusted Snow, the pacing and the way that you built tension throughout was kind of like a waking dream, almost like you're just waiting for it to drop. Was it always your intention to? Were you intentional with the pacing and the tension, or is that just how the writing came about?
Well, thanks for noting that. That was a big challenge, like I'd always wanted to write this story about a world-ending blackout from the perspective of reserve. And on paper, if you just write a story about a blackout and people waiting around for stuff to happen or the lights to come back on, it's kind of like a boring premise, just straight up on paper, right? So yeah, I was very intentional with how I I guess introduce those moments of tension, the frustration of not being in contact with people from the South, of the arrival of these people. And also I had to write these sort of foreshadowing dream sequences throughout too, just to detach the reader from the real moment, so to speak, quote unquote, into this more surreal, maybe almost sort of spiritual interpretation of what was going on for the characters, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it took some hard work, I think, to figure that out. And I had a great editor, Susan Renouf at ECW Press, who really guided me through that process. And yeah, I'd never written, I guess, a thriller or a post-apocalyptic kind of story before. And it was a really important, I think, eye-opening and even character building process for me as a writer, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to get back up just a little, Neves from Forbes Library is saying, I read Moon of the Turning Leaves before Moon of the Crusted Snow, not realizing they were a duology. In a way, without having read the first book, Moon of the Turning Leaves stood out to me not so much as a dystopian novel, but more so as speculative fiction about continued Indigenous persistence and understanding the need for community in order to survive. However the book is categorized or defined, I think that stories like this are important narratives to tell. Can you speak to what motivated you to write the Whitesky story?
Oh, well, thanks for those comments. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad you took that approach too. People ask often, if I read the second one first, will I miss out a lot on, the overall narrative, right? And I don't think so, because there's such a departure in time between the two stories. I think you can read the second one and hopefully fully enjoy it. And then you can go back and read the first one and then have a similar experience too, right? And people, when we think about that, I guess, reverse sequence of encountering stories, those of us who are Star Wars fans all did it with Star Wars, yeah. Where we all watched 4, 5, and 6 until 1, 2, and 3 came out 20 years later, right? So
that's true.
So I like to remind people that too. But yeah, the original, I think, inspiration for the story was an actual blackout that happened in the summer of 2003. It's come to be known as the Northeast blackout of 2003, and it affected several states and a couple of provinces, mostly Ontario, and something like 50 million people were without power, some for a couple of days, some for a couple of weeks, right? And I was in my home community. I was on the reserve the day that happened. I had been living in Toronto working, but I was home for some summer holidays at the time. And this is a very long story. We don't have time to get into it all. But being in my home community in that moment, like I was with my two younger brothers house sitting for our parents, and we thought it was the end of the world. We legit thought it was like the big one.
Here it is. Yeah.
Yeah, this mysterious blackout. Nobody knew what caused it or when the power was going to come back on. So we immediately went into this like survival plan, my brothers and I. And we were on the reserve, thinking about what we were going to do if like chaos enveloped like the big cities to the south, like Toronto and so on, right? But the more we recognized our surroundings and where we were in our own upbringing there on the reserve, we realized that, we were surrounded by resourceful people who didn't necessarily need power or cell phones or any other like satellite technology. We were raised knowing how to hunt and fish and gather and so on. And we recognized that like that was the best place to be to wait out this apocalypse, if in fact that was happening, right? But the lights came back on the next day and we totally forgot our survival plan and we're playing video games again, right? So that's where it all started. And it just really, I think, motivated me to put that sort of Indigenous lens on a post-apocalyptic narrative with the, I think, added value of the perspective of having survived apocalypse already, as Indigenous people. Right. And that's not an original idea at all. Several Indigenous authors have done that excellently. But it was just, my opportunity to contribute to those discussions in that genre. And I'm just, so grateful and so honored that, we're talking about it tonight.
Yes. We have a lot of different questions about kind of Indigenous communities having survived apocalypses already. So while you were a writer in residence at Open Book, you wrote that any Indigenous literature, whether fiction or nonfiction, is post-apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. And it's noted in Moon of the Crusted Snow as well. And Megan from Columbia County Rural Library District is saying, do you think the topic of dystopian novels goes hand in hand with Indigenous stories and experiences? Which it sounds like you do, but she's asking, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it does. Even if it's the story about contemporary Indigenous people, just going through a common experience that people in the mainstream do, you have to consider what the lived experience of the Indigenous characters are, even if they're fictionalized, because, they'll be speaking English or French, speaking a colonial language. There'll be this history, this lived experience of being forcibly detached from culture and land and so on. And there will be, some sort of underlying narrative of, healing and reconnecting with culture and language and family and so on, right? And that's a pretty universal experience for Indigenous people right around the world, and you could arguably say that any settler society where Indigenous people still exist is a dystopia for Indigenous people, because we are barely hanging on to our languages. We are still dealing with the intergenerational trauma of colonialism and the horrors that our ancestors, often just our parents, one generation removed, endured. And I think just having that recognition, if you come from a non-Indigenous sort of settler community, is really important. And it's not, not to speak for everybody, but what I like to say is, we want to open the door to you into our experiences, so that we can build this community together, right? So that we can go into the future with a shared understanding of our real history and hopefully make a good place for the generations to come. So in that sense, yeah, I feel like every Indigenous story is a post-apocalyptic one, but it's how we build a future that is, I think, maybe the more important discussion about how we adapt our stories and speak our truths.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, creating stories and sharing stories is the common theme there. I also read that you once said it was a story that Moon of the Crusted Snow is a story that you wanted to exist in a literary way, but also one that could be shared orally. And that works well with Sydney from Burlington Public Library, who's saying a number of dystopic novels have more open-ended conclusions to their plot lines. Is there a correlation between these stories and traditional Indigenous oral storytelling? And what structural choices did you make to also allow the story to be fluid between both literary and oral storytelling?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think from, I guess, a very basic story delivery standpoint, I wanted to make the language or just the general prose in the books as conversational as possible. Because I think that's largely relatable for most people, and I think it does help, as I mentioned earlier, sort of open that door for anybody else to come in and engage with the story. And the other thing too is that I really enjoy public readings and going out and sharing the books, and I have to be able to speak what I've written to the public, right? So I don't want to trip up on any words or purport to have a better vocabulary than I actually do, when I'm talking to people face to face and so on. So yeah, that's where that sort of conversational tone comes from. And I think that helps the stories sort of intersect between these oral and written realms. In terms of the structure and the, I guess, open-ended sort of conclusion, yeah, I think in some ways that relates to how we deliver our stories. And I speak only from an Anishinaabe perspective, right? I can't speak for all other Indigenous nations. And I only speak to the Anishinaabe experience where I'm from, right, on the North Shore of Lake Huron, in what's now called Ontario. But I think, what I've learned from family, from elders, from knowledge keepers, storytellers, and so on, is that we have these shared stories that have been passed down from generation to generation since time immemorial. And there are some key morals or messages to a lot of these stories. And those are the most important things to relay from generation to generation, right? And what we can do as the individual storyteller is add our own flair or specific interesting details that we want to embellish the story in a way that makes it personalized to us as a storyteller, right? And as long as those key messages are still there about the story, then we've effectively passed it on to the next generation. So in some ways, I hope that answers that question about it being I guess, a more fluid thing, and also something that can be, I think, advanced into the next generation or to the next storyteller and so on.
Yeah. I keep thinking back to kind of the glimpses of Wendigo lore that we have in Moon of the Crusted Snow. Would that be an example of taking some storytelling that's existed historically and putting your own spin on it?
Yeah, and it's really interesting how that came about. That wasn't entirely intentional. That was a little more subconscious. And it's really funny, when I had that revelation that was a Wendigo moment, I was talking to my dad, and he's he's an elder, an Anishinaabe elder. He has tons of stories. He's the person that I learned most of, my cultural knowledge from, spiritual knowledge and so on, history and all that. So I consult with him when I'm writing anything Anishinaabe, right? Especially if there's a ceremonial or spiritual element to it, which I do mostly try to stay away from for several reasons, but sometimes, I do have to touch on these things. So I'll consult with him just to say, is this proper or respectful for me to write about, because it's going to be printed in a book that's going to be available to a lot of people, So we got to be really sensitive around some of these things, because a lot of them we have to keep in the oral realm and we have to keep them to ourselves, right? They're not for everybody to know. So when I was writing Moon of the Crusted Snow, and this is a slight spoiler for those of you who haven't read it, I was coming up to the point where Evan has that dream about Scott, and Scott turns into a monster, right?
Yeah.
So that was always intended. I planned that out, and I was coming up to writing it, and I was like, oh, like the way I envision him morphing into this monster is like this Wendigo imagery that I've had since I was a little kid. So I met up with my dad a few days later for some kind of family function, and I said to him, I was like, "Yeah, Dad, you know the story I'm writing? Like the bad guy, like he's turning into a Wendigo, and I didn't like really plan that." And he said, "Oh yeah, you know, of course, that makes total sense. That you know this character is emerging as a Wendigo to you because you've heard those Wendigo stories since you were a little kid, and you know." They've been ingrained in your, I guess, psyche since then. And that's the beauty of like this cultural knowledge in these stories is that they're there. And even if you don't summon them yourself, they emerge in some kind of, you know, really wonderful ways at times, right? Yeah. So that was like how like the Wendigo emerged to me. And then I think I mentioned it in the acknowledgements. I was like, yeah, thanks to, you know, my family and my community for telling me these stories because like, it really crystallized an important part of the story when I wasn't really fully intending that to happen, right? So it's kind of a cool like little revelation in the whole writing process.
That's always the interesting thing when you're talking to authors about the writing process are the things that were unintentional that like your subconscious basically just gets out on the page. We have several people asking about what inspired you to start writing in general. Was that always something that you wanted to do as a child?
Like a little bit, but I didn't really see like a clear path to being a published writer. Even into adulthood, you know, I was really fortunate to be raised in my community with a lot of, you know, cultural knowledge and stories. And I think when I was a little kid in the 1980s, there was sort of like a cultural renaissance happening in my home community of Wissahickon. And that was a mostly community-wide effort to, I think, heal from the traumas of colonialism and bring back, you know, powwows and sweat lodge ceremonies and fasting ceremonies and so on, right? So that storytelling foundation was built very early on for me. And I think that really appealed me to my culture and, you know, just that transmission of cultural knowledge and stories, right? And then, like, as I learned how to read and write, I really enjoyed that storytelling medium too. And then, you know, I graduated from elementary school from our school on the reserve and then went to high school off reserve and like really became more immersed in, I guess, like the whole literary process in English class in high school. Right. But then that was in the 90s. And like then there was like virtually no diversity in the provincial high school curriculum whatsoever back then, right? It was pretty much just white dudes that we were reading, you know, and you know, some great books, some classics, and so on. But I never saw myself represented in any way in the books that we read in high school. And I very fortunately had an aunt, my auntie Elaine, who recognized that I was really keen on reading and writing, and she started introducing me to Indigenous authors. People who I hadn't heard of, definitely wasn't learning about in high school, but who were out there, you know, blazing trails, like knocking down doors, making sure they were getting published, creating these circles for Indigenous storytellers and writers, people like Lee Maracle, Richard Waughemes, Louise Erdrich, and so on, right? Like just these real revolutionary writers who showed me that our stories were valid enough to be written about in literature and published. So it was in my teen years that things really started, I think, moving forward for me in building that dream. I got into journalism in a whole other way and didn't, you know, really pursue that publishing dream until much later on. But yeah, that's where it started. You know, I was reading Indigenous authors when I was a teenager, and that totally changed my life.
Mm-hmm. Your publishing journey was kind of different too, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. And again, you know, like when you're getting good marks in English class in high school, like of course you'll get accolades from your teacher. But because like there was no representation of Indigenous authors in the curriculum, I don't think like my teachers really knew what to do with me. Like they weren't saying, oh, you should go like get an English degree at the University of Toronto or whatever, right? Like, so I didn't make that connection at all until much later. And that's why I got into journalism, right? But when I was working as a journalist in Toronto back in the early 2000s, I got to know a lot of Indigenous artists in the city, and I got to learn about like the various granting programs that we have, arts grants and so on up here in Canada. And I was encouraged to apply for some because, the people I got to know knew that I was like an aspiring writer. And that's sort of how that really got going. And then, my first grant I got was from the Canada Council for the Arts to what I pitched to them was like revising some of the short stories I wrote as a teenager, putting them into the short story collection. And that's essentially how Midnight Sweat Lodge began. Those stories I revised, I sort of tried to thread them together in like a cohesive narrative. And then, I pitched it to Thetis Books, and, that's how I first got published back in 2011.
And we're so happy you did.
Oh, thanks.
So Pat is asking about, or commenting and asking a question about kind of the way that you use Anishinaabe occasionally without providing translation. Pat saying that they appreciated that, that's something that Gloria Anzaldúa did in her writing, and found that they didn't mind when they didn't know exactly what people were saying, since they could surmise from the context. So Pat is asking, what was your thinking about whether to translate or not?
Oh, thanks for that question, Pat. That was a huge decision, and I think a really important part of the overall writing process for both books. When I took a first draft, or a second draft, maybe it was, of Moon of the Crusted Snow to Susan at ECW. She took her first look at it and liked it, and then offered to publish it. And then when we really got down to the editorial work, when I wrote those early drafts, I wanted to include as much of the Anishinaabe language as possible, because is this story about our people transitioning into the future. And I, of course, want our language to be a part of that. And I should preface everything I'm about to say that by saying that I'm not a fluent speaker. I know quite a bit of it. I speak it, somewhat well. I've known it since I was a kid, but I don't speak the language fluently. And I'm working towards that. So when I was writing that first draft, I would, in dialogue, write some statements or questions that the characters would say in Anishinaabe, in Ojibwe. And then I would have them repeating the same thing in English right after, basically translating it, right? So Susan flagged that right away. She said, why do you have these characters doing this? Like, it's redundant. Nobody would talk like that. If they were talking to another person who understood them, they wouldn't repeat the same thing in English, right? And I said, well, I don't know. Like, I just felt like I had to translate it for people who don't understand it, right? And she said, no, you don't have to do that at all. You can translate it in different ways. You can translate it in the context of the scene, right? You can translate it in the action of the characters responding to this dialogue. Or you can have another character later on in the dialogue respond in English, and that can clear things up, right? Mm-hmm. And it was really empowering to have her tell me that. She said, no, just let your language stand proudly in this English text. And, by then I was in like my early 30s and, still like learning how to write, and I'm still learning how to write. Right. But at that point I was like, oh, wow. Like I'm going with like a more mainstream publisher, whereas I worked with an Indigenous publisher before. This white woman in her 60s, Torontonian, is telling me, a res guy, that, stick up for your language, let it be there, and it was just like a really cool moment for me to have. And I'm always thankful for Susan for doing that for me. So when it came time to work on Moon of the Turning Leaves, a different publisher, different editor, Rick Meyer, I wanted, my language learning had advanced by that point too. And I wanted it to be more conversational, more grammatically complex. And I told him I wanted to take the same approach, and he was totally on board, because he said, this is a really cool opportunity, because you're going farther into the future. You're being much more speculative with this story. So why not have like this language be more front and center? Because he said in several dystopian and post-apocalyptic books, like one trait often is how the language evolves, or how the characters start using different kinds of language or develop their own language and so on. You know, like the Chrysalids, for example, right? Like if you read that, they're using different words than contemporary times and all that. So yeah, again, he empowered me to sort of push that forward. And, you know, it's, I fully recognize that it might be frustrating for some people if they don't like understand exactly what the characters are saying. But especially in the second book, what I always say is there's 88,000 words or so in the whole novel, and something like, you know, 500 maybe are Anishinaabe, so that's like less than a fraction of a percent, right? So, you know, English still dominates, so don't sweat that.
Well, you also talked earlier about telling these stories for everyone to hear, kind of helping to build community and bring community together. So using pieces of your language to do that makes complete sense.
I hope so. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. You know, and it's a proud moment for me. Like I'm just really grateful that I can do that, you know, and that people connect with that, and that also people who don't understand the language or are unfamiliar with it appreciate it too. You know, they like to see the representation, which is really cool.
Yeah, it is. So there's a moment early in Moon of the Crusted Snow when Evan and Nicole decide to go to their friend's house, and Evan recounts the sort of history of alcohol abuse and how it's now banned there, and then pours himself a drink. And then they drink throughout the night, and he and Nicole kind of wake up with what seems like a lot of shame in the morning. And Christy from Fresno County Public Library is saying, how do you approach realistic details that may be traumatizing within the specific history of Native peoples and what their communities have survived?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think in a lot of ways, like Native existence is a paradox. You know, there are things we have to navigate on our own that most other people don't even have to consider, right? And that can be something as mundane to many people as having a drink of alcohol, you know, like, you know, of course, many Indigenous people can drink alcohol responsibly. Many don't at all. They totally abstain, you know. And there are different parts of this journey. There are different realities to being Indigenous. And, you know, it's important to recognize that alcohol was used as a tool of oppression for a lot of people, right? So it's connected to a lot of trauma. It's done a lot of damage to a lot of communities. And in that particular moment, you know, that shows how both Evan and Nicole are still trying to wrestle with that, right? Yeah. So I think, like, for me, it's a matter of trying to be sensitive to that, but also trying to convey contemporary realities and the fact that, you know, maybe some people can sort of indulge in sort of I guess safe and moderate ways, right? And that is a reality for a lot of Indigenous people. But, you know, for them in this community, they feel shame about it because it is banned. And there are several historic moments within the community that are painful for these characters. So yeah, I think it's just, again, part of like the challenges or the decisions that we are faced as indigenous people and how we carry ourselves forward while recognizing the past, right? And then again, just trying to be viewed as normal everyday people like our neighbors in towns and cities everywhere else too, you know? So yeah, it's an interesting discussion for sure.
Jeff from Waubgeshig Public Library saying, what was your greatest challenge when finding a voice for your characters who have personalities opposite of yours? How did you overcome this challenge?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, like I feel so fortunate that I worked for so long as a journalist, and I think that's how I overcome some of those challenges. Is that, you know, I had a front row seat to humanity for basically 20 years, where I interviewed different people every day about different scenarios and situations, different challenges, different points of tension, and so on. And I was able to witness just how different people react, respond, emote, and so on. And that's not to say that, you know, when I write about fictionalized people, I directly draw from those real experiences that I had as a journalist. But I'll really, I think, tap into those memories I have of just that human display that I was able to stand right in front of, you know. And one example I always use when I talk about this is, you know, like interviewing somebody whose house is burning down, which is a terrible experience. You know, I've never gone through that, but I've seen people who have. And, you know, you can, you know, write about that in a news story. You can, you know, lay out all the details, damage estimates, you know, injuries, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're taking a moment like that and writing about it in fiction, you can focus on different things. You know, for example, I remember looking at someone whose eyes were tearing up, and you could see the orange glow of their burning house in the moisture, right, in the eyes. And that's just like such a profound thing to experience as a fellow human being. So I want to approach that reality respectfully, and I want to convey that by pulling at that thread and bringing it to somebody else in a literary form, you know. So to answer the question, yeah, it's like being able to be around people a lot throughout the course of my life, I think has made me more confident in sort of tapping into those different kinds of personalities, those different kinds of cadence of talking, those different desires of humanity, and of course, like the more evil side of humanity too. You know, like that is, you know, a scary road to go down. But as a storyteller, as a writer, it's also really fun. You know, like Justin Scott in the first book and the Disciples in the second book, like I had a blast dreaming those guys up, you know? So yeah, I guess it's just a matter of like being really keen on the human experience and really just trying to tap into it in the most effective way possible as a writer.
So can you talk about how the second novel kind of explores the way the people of the community are able to live more autonomously, on the land as Anishinaabe people, in particular, the juxtaposition between the elder Walter, who has and is able to provide kind of this historical provenance for going back to the old ways, versus Nangons, the younger and other younger children too, who've actually lived the old way their entire lives, or almost their entire lives. There's kind of this interesting juxtaposition between the young and the old here, but the young are kind of like more like the old ways than the old are.
Yeah, that was really fun to explore. I think in that sense, you know, the older generation in the second book, especially, you know, they're living with so much more trauma than the younger generations. You know, especially the ones who are in their 50s and 60s who have survived the blackout. You know, they still have that memory of residential schools. You know, they've heard the stories of being displaced from their elders and so on. They're dealing with the aftermath of all these terrible things. And then the added trauma of the blackout, you know, the end of the world, that really has them shell-shocked in a lot of ways, right? So they're trying to figure out what the path forward is for the whole community while still dealing with all of the things that they're carrying with them, right? So I always have seen like the blackout or the end of the world as really this like liberating moment for them, you know, and it sort of allows them to return to the land on their own terms and really revive the practices that had been suppressed and beaten from them for generations. So the older ones do the work in order for people like Nangos in that generation to be themselves finally as Anishinaabe on the land, living in the way that their long ago ancestors intended for them to, right? And I think that's partially like my own personal commentary on the hard work that generations who came before me did to raise us in culture and with language and ceremony again, because so many people were denied that for several generations here in Canada and the United States, right? So that the way that unfolds, I think, in the second book is sort of like, I guess, like, you know, a metaphor for real life and how that has gone on. But having Nangos like know how to gather and know how to hunt proficiently, and also like never having seen a billboard before.
Right.
It's a really fun way to build that world out through those eyes, right? Those young eyes who only know the bush, So that was pretty fun too.
Yeah, it was pretty fun to read. Kushi from Edison Public Library is saying, how do you draw inspiration, if any, from current events or the world around you when writing? For example, Moon of the Crusted Snow and its sequel, Moon of the Turning Leaves, seem to combine dystopian ideas of anarchy, panic, and blackouts, which we talked about, with a return to traditional values and indigenous identity for sustenance, which reminds me of how Mongolian people balance technology and their traditional ways of living. So how do you draw inspiration from the world around you as you continue to write?
I think the biggest source of inspiration for me is the younger generation, for sure, and the changes I've seen over the course of my life in terms of reviving a lot of traditional practices and getting back to the bush, quote unquote, in some ways, So I'm 45, as mentioned, I grew up in the 80s and 90s when these ways of life weren't always present. For several reasons, mostly that, our ancestors had to endure and survive colonialism and the oppression of the state. But the people who worked to heal, like my parents' generation, the generation before that, and then I guess by nature, my generation, the people who have tried to carry that momentum forward, I think have opened the door for the younger people to really be liberated, be themselves, and do all of these things without shame. So whereas my generation, sure, like we grew up in the bush, where I'm from anyways, and we learned how to do a lot of these things, but we didn't have the language or the ceremonial element as present as the young people do today. And the young people do today because of all the work that happened in the generation before them, Yeah. So what you're seeing now is more skilled younger generations who have that ceremonial, historic, and linguistic knowledge of these practices that they're reviving, and they're sharing it for everyone else to learn from. Like you can see them post about it on Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. So that's like a leveled up sort of renaissance in some ways, So yeah, like in the second book, especially just tapping into Nongos, Cal, Amber, and so on, like showing them being adept at just living in the bush and having that confidence to be themselves is yeah, I draw inspiration from the young people today for sure.
Mm-hmm. Diana from Burlington Public Library saying, thank you so much for sharing your voice with us through your novels. I'm a high school teacher who's teaching the grade 11 course called Understanding Contemporary First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Voices, and had the joy of studying Moon of the Crusted Snow with my students this year. As I am a white settler woman teaching a diverse student population, what is the best way I can approach Indigenous knowledge and voice with the honor and respect it needs? What message do you want to share with students and teachers who are taking or teaching this course?
Oh, thanks for that. And again, I'm just honored to be a part of that course, and I'm so happy to see it out there in schools. Something I wish I had when I was in high school 30 years ago.
Can I interject? Is this a required course in all of Canada?
It's in Ontario. Okay. So yeah, so just this province. And I think it's just school board by school board. I don't think it's a province-wide mandated course, but school boards, I believe, have the option to mandate it so that in grade 11, students take just Indigenous literature.
Okay.
So yeah, and in several school boards across the province, it's mandated learning, right? So yeah, you'll read books by contemporary Indigenous authors, some of the more classic ones, and so on, right?
Okay.
So yeah, it's really cool. It's an awesome initiative. Of course, I wholeheartedly support it, right? So yeah, again, Moon of the Crusted Snow and now Moon of the Turning Leaves have been part of some of that learning, which is just the greatest honor for me. And I was that age when I first started dreaming about becoming a published author, and now all these years later, like what I've written is being relayed to these students, which is just so awesome. But to answer the question, what I would say is like, don't just treat the texts or the books as standalone entities. Consider that they are living things that document a moment in time or a particular cultural truth or historic truth, and that what has led to those books being created is this like revolutionary effort of a people to get their stories published in novel form, by mainstream publishers. And then what's going to happen on the other end is these organic discussions that are spurred from students and everybody else reading these novels, right? So it's a tangible thing, of course, but we have to consider all the intangible, influent things happening around people reading these books and learning about these ways of life and sharing them with each other. So I guess engaging in that, I think, involves talking to the authors, I think is a great initiative. Mm-hmm. But if you can't do that, almost every Indigenous author I know has a wealth of material out there online. They've done several interviews with several outlets or events like this that are still available on YouTube or wherever else. So try to like round out your contextual learning of those books with as much of that as possible, right? And that'll help you answer questions going into those discussions with your students. Because, and also hearing the voice of the person who wrote it, I think can add this real live element to mm-hmm. the book itself, and yeah, everybody I know is on social media too. So like, I don't want to speak for everybody, but you can feel free to reach out to me if you have a question about anything specific in the stories, and, happy to answer whatever you have. So yeah, just think about it all as like this fluid, organic thing of storytelling that we're all very fortunate to be a part of.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And congratulations on being included.
No, thank you.
So we have a lot of people asking about a third book. And Michael says, on a CBC interview, you said you felt pushed to do the second volume, that people kept asking what happened to the characters. Given the reception of the second book being so positive, will there be a third part to the story?
Well, thanks for raising that, because this is always my favorite part of these moments, is that I can give a shout out to the readers who connected with the first book and really encouraged me to think about a second one, because I wasn't thinking about it at all.
Interesting. Okay.
I never intended there to be a part two. For me, it was like a one and done. It was this cool story that I wanted to write, and I got it written and published. And that was like my ceiling for accomplishment. I was like, okay, it got published. If like 15 people read it, then awesome. That's a bonus, Never imagined that it would sort of take on the life that it has.
It was such a perfect ending for another book.
Well, thanks. Yeah. And I didn't see that at first. I was like, for me, that was me like riding them off into the sunset, almost quite literally,
See that?
So that's how I saw that. But yeah, I would do public events and people would ask me about it, and I'd say, no, I'm not, because I wasn't. And they'd be really disappointed when I would be truthful like that. So I had to start like embellishing that a little bit. And eventually I was like, what a gift that is, man. Like, I have these people who enjoy this story enough that they want more. And that's such a privileged and fortunate position for me to be in as the writer / storyteller. So I felt like, yeah, I definitely have to at least try. I owe it to readers who are buying copies of this book. And I also felt like I owe it to the characters, these people who I dreamed up and, felt and continue to feel a very strong emotional connection to, and the opportunity to reanimate them for me and for readers just seemed very special. So that's when I really started taking that seriously. So to answer the question, I'm again just more deeply connected to them emotionally, and yeah, I will consider a part 3. It'll be a while before I do, because I need a break from the end of the world. As fun and as rewarding as these stories have been for me to write, they're also very heavy. So yeah, I'm taking a break. I'm writing a couple other things first, and yeah, maybe in 4 or 5 years time, I'll see what a part 3 could look like.
That's great news. I know that there are a lot of excited people to hear that. Yeah, you did talk about, we talked earlier about kind of like the tension and the pacing in Moon of the Crusted Snow, and it was there for Moon of the Turning Leaves as well, but you gave us at least some comic relief in there. So was that intentional? Was that like something that you needed to put in there? How did that come about?
Yeah, I think, again, when I recognized I had this great opportunity to write a whole other story, it was a chance to do the things that I felt like I didn't really deliver on or really get to explore in the first one. And part of that was like trying to be a little bit funny, at least, and I always intended the second book to be much longer than the first one. Yeah. The first one's like 218 pages or something like that, and the second one's a little bit more than 300. So I was like, okay, I've got a little bit more of a runway to tell this story. And, my whole intention always is to try to humanize these characters as much as possible. Yeah. So I wanted to, try to make some more comedic moments along the way. Right. And also, again, we talked earlier about like the first book being boring on paper of like waiting out this blackout. The second book's about walking through the bush for almost 2 months, trying to see what's going on. That's boring too, right? So I was like, okay, I got to try to find these different moments along the way to make walking through the bush like captivating for the reader. So yeah, I find it so challenging to try to be humorous in writing. So when people tell me they found something funny, like I'm very relieved. And I feel like a bit of a sense of accomplishment too. So actually the novel I'm writing right now, which is a total departure from both of these stories, is, I'm billing it as like a res comedy kind of thing. And whether that all lands, we'll see, but I'm trying my best anyways.
So Karen is saying, I heard you talk about the hopefulness of Moon of the Crusted Snow. Did you feel that way about Moon of the Turning Leaves?
Yeah, I felt like Moon of the Turning Leaves was sort of more hopeful. Like, as you've noted, Brandon, it takes on a slightly different tone. Like, there is more room to breathe, and there is, I think, more of an opportunity to get to know the humanity of these characters. And I think in that sense, like, I was able to draw out that hope. And, when I was doing, like, public events or press for the first book, that always came up. And I always said, this is, of course, it's a post-apocalyptic story, but I want it to be a story of hope. I want it to be an opportunity for people to imagine a different kind of future, or an opportunity that can bring us into a different kind of future, right? But then when I sat down to start dreaming up more of the second book, I reflected a lot on the first one, and I was like, yeah, there's a lot of really grim stuff that happens in the first book. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of despair. And I, saw, me personally, that crowded out the hope for me in some ways. And a word that often gets connected to the first book, and I think it's on the jacket flap too. It says something like the community is reborn, right? Yeah. And then I thought, like, of course, that's how I see it, but there's no actual birth happening in the first book. There's a lot of death, right? Yes. So I was like, okay, I need to like hit the reset button with the second book. And that's why I started the second book with a birth.
With an actual birth, yeah.
An actual birth, yeah, which is like one of the most hopeful things that a human can experience, right? So yeah, I think the second one's a little bit more hopeful in tone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely is. So Amy from Owen Sound and North Gray Union Public Library saying, do you have any input regarding who reads your audiobooks? And Amy's not the only one who asked about the audiobooks. We have a lot of people who love the audiobook. Can you talk a bit about that process? Were you involved at all?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So when ECW started doing the audiobook for the first one, they asked me if I wanted to read it. And I said, no way. not a chance. There is no way I'm going to do the audiobook of this. Partially because I'd read it from start to finish dozens of times by that point. Yeah. And also, like, I am not an actor, like I didn't feel like I could do it, the drama justice that I tried to write, So they said, okay, that's cool. Here's a list of actors, people we have in mind for the audiobook. And right away, I saw Billy Morasti. He's a Cree actor from Manitoba. I've watched him basically all my life, on stage, on screen. And to know that he was available was just like totally mind blowing. So I said, I want Billy, please ask him if he's available. And he was. And it was just such a fun experience doing that with him, so he's Cree. So he's, Cree is a different language than Ojibwe, but, a lot of the words are the same, a lot of the same pronunciation. So I felt he was able to nail that. But also, like, he's got this, like, really great uncle vibe, like this sort of storyteller that you'd expect to tell this kind of story.
Yeah.
So I just loved it. I feel like it's just a wonderful experience to listen to the audiobook because of him, like entirely because of him. So when the audiobook, started coming together for the second one, they said, okay, do you want Billy again? And I said, yes. So, it was kind of a no-brainer, right? So he did the second one too. So yeah, just totally grateful for Billy for bringing his gifts to my stories. Just so amazing. Yeah,
absolutely. I always listen. I listen and read. And so when I started the second audiobook, because I had told you before we came on that I listened to the first book all on a road trip home. And then when I started the second one, I was really happy to hear Billy's voice again.
Awesome. Right.
Great decision. Yeah. Okay. So we have a lot of people asking about kind of your writing process. There were a lot of people saying, did you plan the whole arc, the story arc first? Or did you outline it? Did you know the characters first? Or did you know the plot first? How do you approach your writing process? Do you write 100, 500, 1,000 words a day? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I start with a very basic plot. And I'll just let that idea gestate for a little while. And if it's still with me, if I feel like it's growing in my mind, then I'll decide, okay, like this is something worth committing myself to. So I'll write down like a very basic summary, maybe just a few paragraphs of what the story is. And then I'll get into the character development, because I think for me, that's the most important part. I'll spend a lot of time just writing out these character profiles of all the people who are going to be in the story. And then when I feel like I know them intimately enough to go on this journey with them, then I'll write out like a mapped out narrative, an entire structure, just in point form of the scenes, of the moments, of the building tension, of the climax, and of the resolution, and so on, right? And I think that just really helps me move things along in a linear way. And I'm not like totally beholden to that. Like I do allow for some flexibility I do allow for some things to change along the way. But I think because I worked as a journalist for a long time, that's part of where that planning comes from. And also when I was working as a journalist, I had such little time to write creatively that I had to make the most of that economic time, So planning out really, I think, helped me do that. So yeah, that's basically how it goes. And, I try to do like 1,000 words a day. I think 5,000 words a week is a pretty decent sort of, goal or target. But if I don't get there, then I don't beat myself up or anything like that. Like I never want the process to be frustrating or burdensome to me. As soon as I start feeling things like that, then I'll stop, because this is like such a gift to be able to do, to be creative, and I never want to just feel annoyed by it or frustrated. And as soon as I hit those like writer's blocks, I'll just stop for however long I need to, and then I'll get back into it and be excited again. So yeah, that's my process.
So I read that one of your goals was to have the books translated into Anishinaabe language. Have you been able to do that?
No, not yet. I think that's still a long ways away, but I would love to see it for sure. I don't, it'd probably take like 10 or 15 years, maybe longer, for me to have those abilities. But thankfully, I know a lot of great fluent speakers. And hopefully, like, I could partner with somebody at some point and get some funding, for them to be able to do that. Because it'd be cool. Yeah, it'd definitely be cool to see.
It'd be really cool. I hope that you do get to see that at some point. Okay, so I can't believe an hour has flown by already.
Wow.
But the last question that we like to close with is, who are you reading right now? You named some people earlier that were Indigenous authors that kind of got you interested in writing. But who are you reading now that everybody should run out to the library and check out immediately?
Well, I just finished the other day, The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters. And I think everybody should go out and get that. Amanda's a Mi'kmaq writer from out east. And it's a story about this Mi'kmaq family that goes to Maine, and the youngest daughter goes missing. And the rest of the story is like this parallel sort of narrative between her brother and this other woman who's growing up in sort of the New England area, right? So you can sort of piece together what it's about and what's going to happen, but it's written in such an amazing way that like you're locked in right until the end. So The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters for sure.
Okay, great recommendation. Well, thank you so much, Wob. It's been such a pleasure talking to you for the last hour, and thank you so much for sharing a piece of your culture with us through your novels. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Brandon. It was so fun to chat with you. I can't believe that was an hour already. And yeah,
it goes by really fast.
Just thanks to everybody who joined in online. Like, holy geez, this is so cool. No way. So awesome.
I want to echo that. Thank you for everybody who's tuning in today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll down below the live stream video, you can see the resources area, which contains a link to Wob's books. We look forward to everyone joining us next week on February 18th when we talk with journalist and author Leah Hawkins about his book, I Am Nobody's Slave. Be sure to register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler. Have a good afternoon, evening, whatever time it is.